This is the first time I've ever preached in my sunglasses, and I know this is probably all that you're going to remember about this sermon in a couple of months' time. The reason is that about 7:30 this morning I started to develop a migraine, and when I develop a migraine, I'm unsure whether it's going to knock me out for 3 days or 3 hours. And I thank God that it's only a mild one, but my eyes are sensitive to light, and that's why I'm wearing the sunglasses this morning. And I pray it doesn't actually distract you. One of the most wonderful things is having a child, and it was beautiful seeing Michael dedicated this morning. I was really looking forward to dedicating Michael myself, but because of the situation, I'm thankful that my father-in-law Lynn was able to do that. But regardless, it's a precious thing to have a child dedicated to God. But one thing we need to realize is that it takes a whole community to bring up a child. We're part of that community, aren't we? And today's message has to do with one aspect of bringing up a child, not just Michael, but each other. And today's topic is entitled Vital Words. Now, when I say the word vital, what does that mean? It means you can't live without it. Just like oxygen is vital, you can't live without that, can you? Words are vital as well. But not just any kind of words, as you would know, because words have the power of life and of death. Edward Steichen, who eventually became one of the world's most renowned photographers. In fact, to give you an idea, he took a photo, a black and white one obviously, in 1904. There are only 3 of this particular photo, which is entitled The Pond Moonlight. In 2006, one of these photos was put up for auction. And I had a look on the internet. It's nothing remarkable, except it was taken by a famous photographer at such an early time. At the auction, it raised $2.6 million just for this black and white print. But Edward Steichen, he almost gave up the day he shot his first pictures. At 16, young Steichen bought a camera and took 50 photos. It's pretty easy for us to take photos now on our iPhones and on our cameras on our phones, and doing 50 in a day is pretty simple. But back in those days, and I know some of you are definitely old enough to remember possibly, going to the chemist with that roll of film, putting it in, waiting for it to be developed, and always complaining, I want it within an hour. Back in the 1900s, everyone did it themselves. It was arduous work, but it was exciting. He took 50 photos, but only one of them turned out, a portrait of his sister at a piano. Well, Edward's father thought that was a pretty poor showing, 1 in 50. But his mother insisted that the photograph of his sister was so beautiful that it more than compensated for 49 failures. Her encouragement convinced the youngster to stick with his new hobby, and he stayed with it for the rest of his life. But it had been a close call. What tipped the scales? It was the vision to spot the excellence in the midst of a lot of failure and to encourage. Some of us here have received lots of encouragement, and it has been a real blessing to our lives. Some of us here, unfortunately, have had a lot of discouragement and wonder where our lives would have been if we had just received that encouragement, those words of life, just at the right time. My theme text for this morning is Proverbs chapter 15, verse 4. And if you've got a Bible, turn to it with me. I do prefer the modern rendition. I'm reading this from the New Living Translation. It just makes it a little bit clearer. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 4. And Proverbs is the book that has many wise words in it. And I know each of you will understand that this rings true. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 14. Verse 4. Gentle words are a tree of life, but a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. Gentle words are a tree of life, a deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. Is that true? Yeah. I want to look at a story in the Bible, just one story that some of you are familiar with. And I believe this character got through life because at the start of his life, he had important words, an important message impressed upon his soul. We're going to look in the first book of the Bible in Genesis. Genesis chapter 37. This young man had not just one dream, he had two dreams at the start of his life. As far as we know, he had them when he was 17 years old. It doesn't really say whether it was when he was 17 he got them or a little bit earlier. In Genesis chapter 37 and verse 5, his name was Joseph. One night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Verse 8, his brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. But soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. Listen, I had another dream, he said. The sun, moon, 11 stars bowed low before me. Well, this time he told his dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that, he asked. Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you? What was the message that Joseph received from that dream? In a way, it's quite clear because his brothers and his father understood what it was, that Joseph's dream told him he would be a leader. He had that dream twice. And I believe those words that he would be a leader drove him in his life and gave him hope when he was at his lowest. Joseph started off his life in a pretty good situation. His father was rich. His father favored him, but he also had lots of disadvantages as well. Joseph's mother died, we don't know exactly when, but I'm assuming when he was a teenager. You know, my mum died about 10 years ago and I miss her, but if you're young in your formative years as a teenager and your mother passes away, that's hard. What's it like to be in that situation? Not only that, but he was part of a large family. He was the second youngest. Now, in this day and age, if you are the youngest in the family, it really doesn't mean too much. If you're inspired to be a leader, there's a good chance you can be a leader. But in the old times, it was the oldest who basically got everything once the father died. And if you're the youngest, well, you just got to make a living as best as you can. There wasn't really much hope for you. So Joseph had the disadvantage that his mother died young. He was the second youngest of a huge family. And what did we read before about how his brothers expressed their emotions towards him? They hated him. What chance did Joseph have with the only support of his father, but everyone else except his younger brother was against him? You're going to be a leader, Joseph? Really? And we find out that hatred of his stepbrothers was more than just hatred. It turned into something else. If you go and stay with me in Genesis chapter 37, we find his father asked him to check up on his brothers because his brothers were looking after the flocks. And from a distance away, his brothers see him coming. They hate him so much that they want to plot to kill him. Genesis 37 verse 18. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. And as he approached, they made plans to kill him. Here comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him. Throw him into one of the cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. Fortunately, God stepped in. They didn't kill him, but they did probably something that's worse. 10 verses later in verse 28, we read, so when the Ishmaelites, who are Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern. They didn't kill him, but they sold him for 20 pieces of silver as a slave, and the traders took him to Egypt. A slave. Joseph had those words that he was to be a leader, but how was he going to be a leader when he is a slave? A slave has no rights. You are at the mercy of your master. They could kill you in an instant. They could do whatever they wanted to you. They owned you. You had no rights. I'm not sure what your situation is right now while you're sitting here. You might be a slave to the bank and money, feeling crushed by huge debts and don't know how to get out. And maybe God's given you words of encouragement that you will be free of this one day. And you think, how can this happen? Can it get any worse? Well, for Joseph, it got worse. You know, God was still with Joseph. And Joseph could have made the decision, I'm going to give up on God. He gave me these dreams, but look at what's happened. My brothers hate me. They wanted to kill me. They sold me as a slave. Now I'm in a foreign territory. I can't even escape because I look different to the Egyptians. I need to learn their language. I don't know anything about them. Just going to give up. But Joseph doesn't. And something amazing happens, because even as a slave in Potiphar's household, because Potiphar purchased Joseph, Potiphar noticed that whenever Joseph made decisions, things worked out. It was like a special blessing on him. And fortunately, Potiphar was a smart guy and said, hey, if I put Joseph in charge of my household, everything will run smoothly. And this would have encouraged Joseph, and he's saying, God, I am a leader, but I'm a slave leader. What's going to happen? And that's the incredible thing about God. We may be going through really tough circumstances and think, where is God in all this? And then here and there you'll get just a glimpse, a flash, and say, I know God is with me. He's still there, even though I might not be able to see him. But just when it looks like Joseph's fortunes are going to change, maybe Potiphar was going to say, hey, look, you'd be far better as a free man than a slave. I'll make you free. Something happens to Joseph that was even worse than being a slave. In Genesis chapter 39, and verse 14, there was a certain individual, Potiphar's wife actually, who took a fancy to Joseph. Joseph wasn't just Potiphar's slave, but he was also Potiphar's wife's slave as well. And she wanted something that he wasn't willing to give. Genesis 39 verse 14, she called, I'll just read out a little bit earlier here, verse 10. Let's read verse 8. We'll read from verse 8. Actually, let's go back a bit further. Joseph, so this is the last part of verse 6. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. But Joseph refused. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. But she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. Verse 11. One day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. She came, she grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Verse 11, when she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants, and soon all the men came running. Look, she said, my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard my scream, he ran outside and got away, but he left his cloak behind with me. Being accused of rape, he ended up in prison. Now, I can tell you something. When you're in prison, the other prisoners want to know why you're there. It's just like, if I meet you on the street, I want to know what you do. Prisoners want to know why. What did you do to end up in prison? And if you're smart, you'll probably say, well, I tried to hold up a bank but got caught. Because if they find out that you're a rapist, they will, you need to very quickly be put into protective custody within the prison. That's prisons these days. I'm not sure what it was like in Joseph's time. The Bible doesn't tell us what he had to go through. But Joseph could have given up. The dream, the words that were spoken to him when he was 17, that you will be a leader. God, I almost was a slave leader. I was in a position where I could use the gifts that you've given to me. And now here I am in prison. I am labelled with a horrific crime that I did not commit. Everyone in prison says they're innocent, but no one believes each other. How can these words become a reality in my life? Am I going to stay here in prison and rot away? This is why I really love the story of Joseph, because I don't think any of us have gone as low and been in a situation like he has. The one thing Joseph did is he believed those words of encouragement despite the circumstances. These words that he was given were vital words to his life, and he chose to believe them. And in the midst of the horrible situation he was in, the one in charge of the prison began to see that when he allowed Joseph to do things, things ran smoothly. It was like that there was a special blessing on him. And those of you who know the story knows it ends well. Eventually, the Pharaoh, the head of the country of Egypt, was directed to use Joseph's services. He pulled Joseph out of prison, and the next thing, Joseph became the Prime Minister of Egypt. He became a leader. And those words that were spoken of him came true. It took, I think, 13 years. He was 30 years old when that happened. Not only did God use him as a blessing for his family, because he saved the family when the years of drought came, it was a blessing to the whole world because he held on to those vital words that were spoken into his life as a young man. Have you had words spoken to you of encouragement, words that you can really believe? You know, yesterday I printed out a whole lot of words that my wife Karina has, and I just want her to come up. And children, there wasn't a story this morning, so I've got an activity for you, should you want to. If you want to, the children, if they want to come up and take some of these words of encouragement and just give one to each adult here. I think I made about 80, so I'm not sure. There's probably about 80 of us here. So children, if you want to come up and just grab from Karina, my wife, some of those and hand one to an adult. Come back and get more, grab a whole lot, just one per adult. And you can give them to the other kids as well. And adults, as you receive this, I know you're going to look at it and smile, and each one's different, by the way. But I want you, I guess, to look at these few words, whatever you receive, as a message from God to you. I'm hoping it applies. I know there's one that says something about how big your muscles are. But these words of encouragement, we find them hard to accept from other people, don't we? And we know God gives us words of encouragement, and we say, yeah, that's great, God, but for some reason we don't really believe them. I think it's time we start believing these things about ourselves. Because it's so easy just to focus on the negative in our lives. When we look in the mirror, when we think about ourselves, we always think that we're not really good. But the interesting thing is when we ask someone else to comment, what do you think of such and such? They usually say they're a lot better than you think that you would say yourself. People see a lot more good things in ourselves than we see in ourselves. I just want to read out a few of these while the children are handing them out. I read some out this morning to Daisy at breakfast just before I got my migraine, and she loved it. But isn't it nice when people say things like, I think you're fantastic. You did a great job. Thanks for being such a great kid. Or, you make me smile. I appreciate the young man or young woman you are becoming. I like you. Spending time with you reminds me of how special you are. Well, you are an interesting person. Though that sometimes could mean a couple of things, can't it? But let's look at it positively. I like how your mind works. Thanks for being a hard worker. You're such a great example. I'm grateful that God gave you to me. I want to finish off with some words that Jesus said, vital words that Jesus said. Now, I know we've got 4 Gospels there. There's lots to choose from. But I just want to focus on this last reference, which gives us what Jesus' mandate was. Why did Jesus come to this earth? Because to me it's so encouraging. It's in Luke chapter 4, and we'll read from verses 16 to 22. And I want to end on these words, the words of Jesus. Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 22. When he came to the village of Nazareth, this is Jesus, his boyhood home, he went as usual to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up to read the scriptures. And the scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where this was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Are you poor here? Jesus has good news for you. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released. Are you a captive? And I mean not in prison, but captive by circumstances, by debt, by relationships or whatever. Christ has come to set you free. He has come so that the blind will see. Now, I know we don't have people here who are physically blind. I don't believe we do. But lots of times we are blinded by situations that we are in that we don't even realize. We just know things are going wrong in our life. We don't know why. I say, God, help me to see what the problem is. And God says, I will help you see that the oppressed will be set free and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. And he rolled up the scroll, he handed it back to the attendant and sat down. And all the eyes of the synagogue looked at him intently. They looked at Jesus after he said these words. And then Jesus began to speak to them and said, the scripture you've just heard has been fulfilled this very day. Friends, you're probably saying to me, but I'm not free now. I'm still oppressed. I'm still struggling. Well, Joseph, at the age of 17, had those vital words spoken to him that he would be a leader. And every day for the next 13 years, he was saying, I'm not a leader. I'm struggling. Things are going wrong. When is this going to happen? I want to tell you this morning that when God says it, it will happen. We just need to trust. We need to step forward with him. Sometimes we need to ask him to carry us through our situations. But do not let go. Joseph never let go of God, and he came through and he became a leader of the world back then and blessed so many people. And God can do the same to you this morning. Vito, Sabina, you've got a precious child, Michael, there. I love his name, obviously. With God's blessing, with God's wisdom, you can speak words of encouragement and power in his life. And I know he will change the world in whatever way God has designed him for. God bless you all.